Hi guys, my name's Seb Tudor, I'm the man on the Silver Mountain, and welcome back. Today I wanted to talk about this whole free speech war that's been kicking off over the last few months. Has ties back to things that have been going on the internet and not for quite a significant amount of time, good couple of years. But ultimately, it's a big issue, I feel, especially considering that you've got people who are screaming freedom of speech or trying to suppress freedom of speech, either for um, non factual reasons, entirely emotional ones that are completely irrational, uh, reasons that are coming from not really understanding what the freedom of speech in their country actually is, and things like that, especially when they're trying to infringe on freedom of speech and then say, oh, well, it won't infringe on your freedom of speech when actually it would by law. So, I wanted to go through this, but obviously, first we need to know actually what we're talking about. And this has been kicking off mostly in kind of Western countries, and considering I'm in the UK, a lot of this is coming out of the US and Canada. I thought I'd go through the laws and other things that surrounding um, those countries and the arguments that are going on. So let's take a look at the UK first, considering that's where I am. And the freedom of speech here is one of the more curtailed and kind of limited of the ones that we're going to be looking at just now, because you have freedom of expression and the right to um, believe and say and do as you wish, provided that you don't touch on things that are threatening and abusive. But also, it even goes so far as to even still on the books, even if it can't necessarily be prosecuted for. But things like speaking out on behalf of the abolition of the monarchy, for instance, is a thing that is still on the books in the UK, even if you can't be properly prosecuted for it. It's still there, and there are still things that specifically state um, uh, concerning things in regards to the corruption of public morals and outraging public decency, which personally doesn't make any sense to me, considering how decency and morals are so subjective and ultimately pointless. But it all comes back from us being a very old, kind of Christian based country at this point in time, and these things have been on the books for hundreds of years. And so as a result, they may not be actively applied, but they're a bit daft. But we also have some of the strictest anti-defamation kind of rules and things like that attached to freedom of speech in the Western world. And so, with a significant burden of proof on for such a thing to be put through. And so, you've got a fairly wide permit still to just say and do and be and believe whatever you want, but at the same time, it's much more restrictive here than in the other two that we're going to look at. Now, in America, you've obviously got the First Amendment that people will yell and scream and shout for whatever reason, which protects all manner of things, from the freedom of exercising whichever religion you choose, to freedom of speech, to freedom of the press, and the right to peaceful assembly and petitioning government and all that kind of thing. And it's very, very wide open. There's arguably the whole national security thing that also gets brought up, and obviously you do have defamation laws and things like that as well. But for the most part, freedom of speech is just that. You're allowed to say and believe and do whatever you want, as long as you aren't going to cause harm. As said, it's right to peaceful assembly, not anything else. And so as a result, there you've not got as many other restrictions that have been put in over time. Good, mostly because America is also a much younger country than the UK, so they haven't had the time to accumulate those additions. But also just because it's a very wide open law, and they've not seen really to touch on it so much, because people can say whatever they like. It doesn't mean that they can necessarily act on it, and if they do, then there's still, you know, good reason for them to get into trouble with the authorities and whatever else otherwise. And then moving on to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which protects, you know, fairly straightforward, the freedom to thought, belief, opinion, expression, and including press and media communication freedoms as well. And obviously, you know, there are provisions limiting things like defamation and hate speech and things like that as well. But again, for the most part, it's a very open situation. Now, why is it that you've got people yelling out about a freedom of speech war, or how people are trying to suppress freedom of speech? And simply put, it's because you've got a collective on both sides of the political spectrum who will come out and they will want to suppress the things that they don't like and promote the things that they do. And they want to force as many people to do that as possible. And now this is where you may very well have seen towards the end of last year, you had Jordan B. Peterson in Canada, who was having an argument over this in regards to the use of various pronouns and being forced to use them. And he wasn't stating that he wouldn't necessarily if someone politely asked him to, but what he was saying was that writing it into law that you had to use these, you know, someone accidentally misgendering a transgender individual could actively be thrown into the deep end, hot water and all, just because they had made a mistake or just because they had misspoken. You know, it's an interesting thing on that point because of the political push with it. But then you've also had this going back a couple of years where you had feminists wanting to ban the word bossy. And it's a case of, well, banning words doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. They don't have any innate power. It's the reactions that have power, and you are reacting disproportionately to the people who are using the word. In which case, guess what? You're reacting in such a huge way, blowing this out of proportion, that you're not really helping your cause. You're just making a lot of noise, and eventually someone might notice, someone might get on your side because you're playing the victim all the time, but otherwise it's not going to do you any good. So now we get to the present, and we've got this freedom of speech war idea, where you've got the people who want to act in a more authoritarian and controlling way coming up against the people who just want to express themselves and express their views in the way that they have always expressed them. Now, it's a difficult thing to touch on here because, as we've said, you know, the freedom of speech laws are quite nebulous in various places, and the place where they're most restrictive is where I am, and yet still it allows me to say whatever I like as long as I'm not actively going out and suggesting treason or defaming someone without kind of good cause, or without some kind of explanation of why, or inciting violence and stuff like that, you know. So just speaking, I'm still allowed to do, and I'm still allowed to express whatever opinion I would otherwise have. And so when it comes down to this war, it's almost exclusively happening on social media and then spilling out into the rest of the world. And it comes from the outrage culture, and it comes from kind of the self-victimizing mentality of a lot of these people on both sides. And so when it comes to this war, it obviously isn't a war. First off, that's hyperbole in the extreme. But does it have the potential to infringe on the rights and the lives of the many? Just because there are a few that are upset. And yes, it does, unfortunately. You know, the stuff with Jordan Peterson in Canada last year kind of demonstrates how the minority, with a little bit of kind of noise making, is then able to kind of promote their cause and their wants in such a way that then they will gain that support and put pressure on people who are just living their lives. And so that's the kind of situation and how it's got to this point to a degree. And so I would now like to just kind of suggest a couple of options for us to move forward with. And most of these go to the people who are probably not watching this video, who don't care about the actual freedom of speech and who want to suppress it. But it's mostly on them. These couple of things lie. And firstly, I've said this numerous times, you control the way you feel. Saying, a girl feels terrible because she's called bossy will teach that child that she is control of her own emotions and that she is resilient in and of herself. And that way anyone can say anything to her and it won't matter. If you're, it's not only girls that are told that they're bossy as children. It may be more predominant because little girls are more vocal, but it does happen to everyone, to one degree or another. Banning the word will do nothing. Whilst teaching that child that actually they don't need to listen to other people, they can be self-sufficient, they can control their own minds, their own bodies, their own thoughts, their own emotions. Teach that child that, and they will forever be in a good state to continue with whatever it is that they want to do. Teach them some resilience, encourage that resilience, encourage the rational thinking and the responsibility for themselves that promote those things to make them a strong person, and they will go on and be fine, regardless of what people say. In regards to the individuals who want to make exceptions or push legislation on behalf of minorities, be they religious minorities, be they ideological minorities, be they medical minorities, whoever, they are still a minority. And the laws of a land, or the things that are going on there, need to represent the majority, and you're not going to get that without freedom of speech. The fact that you are able to come and protest or put your point across is a benefit that you have as a result of freedom of speech. It's something that you have been gifted and something that you've been allowed to use to get your point across. In which case, stop trying to suppress freedom of speech, grow a spine, and face up to the arguments against you. If you find your argument crumbling, if you find that actually there is no support for what you're saying, reevaluate. Be willing to be wrong and be willing to learn. Because otherwise, you're going to continue to run up against opposition after opposition, obstacle after obstacle, counter after counter, and eventually you're going to burn yourself out and wear yourself down until all of your arguments have been completely removed and there's nothing left of you. Now to the people on the other side who are literally the advocates for freedom of speech, who want to say whatever it is that they want. They're not infringing too far over on laws, or they're not overstepping what they're allowed to do. To those people, what I would like to suggest is, when we've got this privilege, and I don't mean to use that word lightly, because obviously there are going to be people that take privilege and start throwing it around in all kinds of different ways. I mean, the law of the land allows you to do this thing. Yeah? You don't have to be allowed to do that thing, but you have been allowed to do that thing in the place in which you happen to live. For those individuals who are quite happily kind of expressing themselves using that right, there still needs to be an empathy from this side as well. I would count myself more in terms of being on the side of freedom of speech and saying what you want, as I would imagine is quite obvious. But you still need to empathise with the people on the other side who maybe don't want it. Why is it that they don't want it? Why don't they want people to be free to speak? Gain that understanding. Try and find common ground and work through it with those people, instead of just going, no, you're trying to take away the thing that I have. Go to hell. You're not allowed to do that. You can argue your points, but also the way to convince and persuade people and have them understand is to empathise, find common ground, and let them see your side whilst you're seeing theirs. And so, where I have seen an awful lot of people kind of throwing their arms up in the air and making a big noise about kind of the freedom of speech and how it can't be taken away and how it's a thing that needs to exist, I agree. But then I'm also seeing along with that an awful lot of negativity flowing at the people who are protesting in the first place, who are making the upset, who are maybe very, very authoritarian or not wanting freedom of speech for one reason or another. You know, you are going to run up against those people who will not listen to discussion, will not, as I've said before, don't bother with those people. Move on. Freedom of speech is a great thing. It is one of these things that allows us to communicate so openly because, quite frankly, communicating mind to mind isn't a possibility yet. Speech, writing, expression, it's the only thing that we've got that we can use to make a difference to each other, make a difference to the world around us, work together. And so as a result, it needs to be preserved. But we don't need to be dicks about it whilst trying to preserve it. Think about how strong the feelings towards freedom of speech would be if we could exercise our freedom of speech in such a way that we are able to convince and to help and to open lines of discussion to those individuals, to help them come across and see it from our point of view, so that then they realise that if it hadn't been for freedom of speech, they wouldn't be allowed to do what they are doing so far. But anyway, tell me what you guys think. Should it be a more open discussion? Should it be something that we need to promote more in a positive way? Or is it something that we need to shut down the opposition to straight away? Or are you one of these individuals that wants to get rid of freedom of speech? Oh, camera's unfocused. There we go. Are you one of these people that wants to get rid of freedom of speech? If so, why? You know, let's start this conversation right here. Have the discussion right now in the comments down below. Why do you want to get rid of freedom of speech? Why suppress it? What is it that upsets and worries you about it? You know, let's have this discussion here. Let's get it going. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, guys, and I will see you in the video tomorrow. Take care. Thank you very much for watching, guys. If you like this video at all, then please leave us a like and subscribe for more, and we'll see you in the video tomorrow. Take care.